Hey there, Pastor Rob here. This fall, in our worship services and in the Sunday school class that I teach, the adult education class, we are going to be focusing on the book of Leviticus. Now, I don't want that to scare you off. I realize that for many people, you hear Leviticus and it sounds like it's a book that is outdated or irrelevant. It's a book that has a lot of rules and regulations about everything from mold and mildew to skin sores to offerings and sacrifices. And we might wonder if any of that has any relevance for us today. I've spent a lot of time the last couple months really digging into this book. I've spent a lot of extra time studying it, and I have come to see in really new and I think exciting ways how the gospel is really on full display in the book of Leviticus. So I'm really looking forward to preaching and teaching through this book. One of the things that I thought might be helpful or beneficial or maybe interesting to try to do is something that I'm calling Levitical Living. And essentially what that is a way to maybe bring us back into some of the Old Testament practices, the laws and the regulations that were in the book of Leviticus, and to help us find a way to practice those laws and to abide by these Levitical laws, really as a way to deepen our understanding and our appreciation for what this book is all about. Now, how do we do this? Well, there's a couple things that I want to just sort of preface this with, and then I'm going to just kind of take you through some of the things that you can do if you decide to do this. And that's maybe the place that I want to start. This is entirely voluntary. This is not something that you should feel compelled to do. This is not something that you should feel pressured to do. This is entirely up to you whether or not you want to participate. For those of you that are interested and those of you that would like to deepen your understanding of the laws of Leviticus and how they were lived out in ancient Israelite times, this is, I think, a way you can do that. But others of you maybe aren't really all that interested in doing this, or you feel you've got other things going on, and so you shouldn't feel any pressure to do this. And then related to that, I think it's always important to remember what Paul talks about in Colossians chapter 2. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul reminds us that we have been set free from the laws and the regulations and the rules of Old Testament Judaism. So I want to make it very clear that this is not an effort to try to go back to something that has been fulfilled in Christ. Maybe that goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. This should not be approached as an exercise that will somehow gain you something that you don't already have in Christ. We have been set free from the power and the penalty of sin, and only Jesus can do that. However, by stepping back into some of these Levitical laws, what we will do is we'll be able to try to experience just a little bit of what ancient Israelites would have experienced as they tried to keep the laws of Leviticus. Now, I should also add that this is a pretty significantly modified approach to keeping these laws. It would be pretty difficult to keep all of them completely. And so what I've done is I've approached some of the major categories of these laws, and I've tried to come up with a way that you can observe them in a 21st century culture. And so if you were an ancient Israelite, this would probably look a little bit different, but the point here is sort of to create a simulation. And so again, this is not going to be exactly how they would have kept it in ancient Israel, but it should give you a little taste of it. So with that being said, I think I should say one more thing. How you choose to actually practice this is entirely up to you. There's a couple of different ways that you could do it. You could choose to do it for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's really up to you. I would say probably a minimum of 1 week would be best. If you really want to get the full experience, you could go for a full month or even September through the end of December if you really wanted to try it. it may help you to just sort of journal or reflect along the way. Like, ask yourself questions about, what are you finding difficult about this? What do you think these rules or these laws were meant to teach? What is it that you see in yourself as you practice these laws? And just kind of jot down your thoughts and your reflections as you do this. And again, always do this with an eye towards what Christ has done for us. I think maybe that's the other key point, is all of this should point us more fully to Jesus. Okay, with that said, let me just take you briefly through some of the laws that I've put together, or some of the ways that I think you can keep these laws. There's a handout that will come with this, and so I think that will be important. The handout will be available at church on the table near the entryway. If you don't have it or you can't find it, just email me and I'll get you a copy. The reason that's important is because there's a whole bunch of little specific animals and foods and things that are on that sheet. I'll cover them very briefly here, but it'll help you to have that. So the first is dietary laws. Jewish law, kosher law, or kashrut, were very detailed. The laws that govern ancient Israel were very detailed. Probably it will be, and by the way, it's still practiced today in Jewish communities. Probably it will be very difficult for you to observe these laws in totality today. Part of that is because you have to buy all kosher food, and kosher food is food that's sacrificed under the supervision of a rabbi so that they can make sure that the blood is drained out properly, and so on and so forth. So what I've given you is really just a list of foods that you can and cannot eat. And so, again, this is a modified version. If you really want to go the extra mile, you could look for kosher food at your local grocery store and stick only to kosher food. But if not, the rules are generally animals that you are permitted to eat are animals that both have split hooves and they chew the cud, or sea creatures that have both fins and scales. So that's kind of the principle that governs kosher laws. And you can also eat, Jewish people were also permitted to eat birds as long as they weren't birds of prey. Now, on the handout, I've given you a full list of food that is acceptable. And food that is unacceptable. So you won't be eating any pork, badger meat, which probably will be a real stretch for some people. No rabbit meat, no shrimp, no lobster, no shellfish, no vulture meat. Again, sorry. Turkey, that interestingly falls under kind of a vague category because at the time there wasn't clarity on whether or not turkeys were scavengers. So, but for this, you treat that as off limits. And then no insects. And so some of these foods you're going to have no problem abstaining from. Like if you were eating insects frequently, you might want to, get that checked out. But the other foods, again, the main thing that you might have trouble with are pork and shellfish. But so consider those things off limits. Now that means what you are permitted to eat: beef, lamb, chicken, goat, geese, duck, tuna, salmon, herring, fruits and vegetables. But make sure there's no bugs or insects on those fruits or vegetables if you don't do that already. Here's the interesting law that's kosher laws. But then there's a second principle that comes into play, and that has to do with the way that dairy and meat could never be mixed. There's a law that sometimes quoted in the Old Testament that it sounds like a really strange law. The law says you shall not boil a goat in its mother's milk. And the interpretation of the law has come to mean that dairy and meat were not to be mixed together. And so what that means is if you're going to honor this completely, you need to make sure that not only are you not eating foods where dairy and meat are present in the same food, so like ham and pineapple pizza, or really any pizza, because if it has cheese on it and if it has meat on it, I suppose you could eat a cheese pizza, but any pizza with meat on it, you've got dairy and meat mixed together, so that would be considered off limits. But more than that, it actually gets more challenging because even today, Jewish people, they not only do they refrain from eating food where dairy and meat are mixed together, but they actually, all of the utensils and the tools for cooking and preparing the food must be kept entirely separate. And so even in very observant Jewish homes, they will have a part of the kitchen dedicated to dairy and a part of the kitchen dedicated to meat. And so if you're going to practice this, what I would suggest that you do is get a separate set of utensils, cooking dishes and things, and one of them would be used for preparing dairy, and then you'd have a separate set of utensils and pans and pots and things for meat, so that in everything that you're doing, you're really trying to keep separate every piece of dairy and every piece of meat. When you dry your dishes, you should use a separate dish towel. So you use one towel for drying the dishes that you use to prepare the meat and another for the dairy. So the point is that everything is to be kept separate. Now you're asking, why would you do that? Well, the principle is, the truth be told, there's some difference of opinions on exactly what the principle is. But in short, the idea here is that dairy is the product of something that is life-giving, namely an animal that is nursing, that is providing milk. That's life-giving, that's life-nourishing. Whereas meat is the result of something dying, because an animal has to be slaughtered. And so by keeping those separate, you're keeping life and death separate. And so if you're going to observe this, that would be one thing that you'd want to do. Now, the second area of practicing Jewish law has to do with daily sacrifices. Now, if you read through especially the first 9 chapters of Leviticus, you know that the people of Israel were bringing sacrifices an awful lot. There were always offerings and sacrifices being brought to the tabernacle. I do not want you bringing animals to church for me to slaughter and put on an altar. I'm not going to do that for you. However, today, in Jewish communities today, because the temple has been destroyed and the Jewish people are still waiting for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Jewish people today don't practice animal sacrifices, but what has happened is that prayer has replaced these animal sacrifices. And so what I'm going to ask you and encourage you to do, if you're going to practice this, you will say prayers at 3 separate times during the day. Today, devout Jewish people still do this. I was at an airport some couple months ago, and it was the time for afternoon prayers, and I watched as a Jewish person put on his prayer cap and recited all the Jewish prayers, because that was the time of day. Now, you're not going to do any of that, except for you will take time morning, afternoon, and evening to say prayers. The first prayer, your morning prayer, you actually would ideally say this before you get out of bed. It's a prayer of thanksgiving for the gift, thanksgiving to God for the gift of a new day, for new life, for life and health and strength. You might offer an additional prayer of thanksgiving using Psalms 145 through 150. You might pray one of those prayers or read one of those prayers. And your prayer will conclude with what is called the Shema, which is, you will simply say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your strength." That's the conclusion to your prayer. That's the morning prayer. The afternoon prayer, to practice this properly, requires that you actually stop whatever it is that you're doing. It becomes a discipline. You can set a time or a timer on your phone or whatever. But set a designated time sometime in the middle afternoon, no matter what you're doing, whether you're busy, whether you're in the middle of something. Devout Jewish people tend to take this very seriously, and you will say a prayer using the words of Psalm 145. It's usually a prayer of confession, and so during this time you will actually acknowledge sins and shortcomings before God. You'll confess them, and you'll recall God's mercy and his compassion for you. So that's your afternoon prayer. And then finally, the evening prayer is usually right before you go to bed. It's interesting reading up some of the Jewish laws and rules and regulations about when does the evening begin and when does the afternoon end. And sometimes you do the afternoon prayer at the very end of the afternoon, and you do the evening prayer right after it because the time crosses over. But we're not going to worry too much about that. If you want to do your evening prayer, you do it before you go to bed. You're going to focus this time on God's providence. You're going to focus on how God sustains heaven and earth, how he cares for his creatures. You're going to thank God for his word, and you'll thank God for the gift of salvation. And then this prayer also will conclude by saying the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength." So, morning prayer, prayer of thanksgiving for the gift of a new day, for health, strength, and any other words of gratitude to God, and you conclude with the Shema. The afternoon prayer is a prayer of confession. acknowledging sins and shortcomings and thanking God for his mercy and his compassion. The evening prayer before you go to bed is a prayer giving thanks to God for his providence, for the way that he cares for us, sustains us, watches over us. Okay, skin sores. You might be aware, in the book of Leviticus, there are quite a few rules that have to do with sores and open wounds and things on a person's body. Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 go into some detail about what those all are. I wrestled a little bit with how to do this, because normally what you'd have to do, if in Old Testament times, you'd have to come and you'd have to show your wound, or you'd show your sore to a priest, and the priest makes a designation. Is this sore a harmless sore, or is it something more serious? And if it's more serious, then you become unclean, and then you have to come back to the priest 7 days later. And so there's all these rules and regulations. I simplified it here. I can tell you most assuredly, I do not want you to come to me showing me your open sores and wounds. So, and of course, yeah, I'm pastor, not, there's a whole bunch of other things. But what I thought we would do instead, I thought this is maybe the best way to simulate this. I've created an email address that is essentially a throwaway email address. What you'll do, if you notice that you have any kind of sore on your body anywhere, what you're going to do is you're going to, it'll be any kind of open sore, any kind of rash, any kind of blister, boils, a burn, a sore with a hair in it, white, black, or yellow, whatever that means. I'm not exactly sure. But if you have that, then this applies. What you're going to do is you're going to take a photo of it, and you will send it to an email address. The address is livinglevitically@yotmail.com. Now, this address, I am never going to check it. I have about as much interest in looking at pictures of your sores as you do in showing them to me. So I'm not going to check it. I'm not going to look at it. And furthermore, the email address is going to disappear. It's going to cease to exist in a short amount of time. In fact, it's very possible you'll send it and it'll get bounced back to you as undeliverable. So keep in mind and understand that this is really more of an exercise. I'm not going to be looking at your photos, but that's the best way that I thought that you could simulate that practice of showing a sore and tending to it. So that's what you'll do. Now, final section, and this is the most personal section, and so it will be entirely up to you as to how to, or to what extent that you would practice this. There are a number of laws in Leviticus that have to do with bodily discharge, particularly for what to do during a woman's monthly menstrual cycle. And obviously this is very personal, and it's very, private, and they only apply to women. I had coffee with a friend of mine, a Jewish rabbi here in town, and he described the practice for me. And I'm going to try to simulate this here because I found it really fascinating. And there's a link, by the way, on the handout where you can actually learn much more about this practice. But every month, what happens during it's actually about a 10 to 14 day period during the women's leading up to, and then for 7 days following the woman's menstrual cycle. What happens is the woman is then considered to be nidah. Now that's unclean, but don't interpret that to be anything in terms of moral purity or anything of that sort. It just means that they are experiencing this time of discharge. And during this time, and it actually means more separate. It's a time of separateness. So during this time, what the woman would do even today is she maintains separateness from her husband. Now, that doesn't mean that they, go and live in separate homes or something, but they do not have any physical contact with one another. So what some Jewish women will actually do is they will, their bed will be actually made up of like two double-sized beds that are pushed together. And then during this time period, those beds are moved apart. They're separated so that there's no physical contact between the husband and the wife. During that time, husband and wife, they obviously would abstain from sexual relations because they're not having any physical contact. And so hard to do that if you're having without physical contact. In some cases, what couples will do, they won't have even any, they won't even, touch one another, or they won't even, so like if you had to pass a jar from husband to wife, what they would actually do is the husband would have to put it down on the table, and then the wife would have to pick it up, because there's to be absolutely no contact whatsoever during that period of time. Once this 2-week period is complete, then what the wife would do, she actually goes to something that's similar to a spa experience. It's a ritual bath called a mikvah. And during that time, it's really meant to be a relaxing and yeah, it's meant to be sort of a spiritual experience. And she would go into that bath and she's cleansed and it's very relaxing and it's meant to be a very enjoyable experience. And then after that, she would go home to her husband and they would come together again. Now, obviously that, and so actually it's about a 2 week period of time every month that the husband and the wife are actually not having sexual relations. And then during the time when they're together again, they're encouraged to have frequent sexual relations. The reason for this is that during that 2 week period of time, they're really meant to focus on the non-sexual part of their relationship. They're really meant to focus on encouragement and nurturing the other aspects of their relationship. How you choose to practice this, I'm just sort of giving this to you as information. I'm not going to prescribe any way, obviously, because this is so personal. I'm not going to suggest any specific way in which you practice this. I'm only going to just describe to you how it's done today, and I'll leave it up to you to exactly how you'd want to practice that. So you've got all the sort of the rules and the regulations. I'm excited about again studying, working through, preaching, teaching through this book of the Bible that's often neglected but is very powerful. And I'd invite you to come in and join and be a part of it to the extent that you're able. And I would love to hear any of your own reflections as you do this, what you learn along the way. What does this teach you about God? What does it teach you about your relationship with Him? How does it help you see Christ more fully? I would love to hear it. Let me know. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing what this all is, how this all goes.